Bisi stared at the blood-soaked cap on the floor, her body trembling. Then came the sound, soft at first, like something being dragged across the ground. It was coming from the back of the house. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound grew louder, a slow, deliberate scraping. Bisi turned her head toward the dark hallway leading to the back room. She couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over her own breathing. The baby on her back let out a sharp cry, and the noise stopped. Silence felt so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Leave us alone," she shouted, her voice breaking. Then, the dragging sound began again, closer this time. The unseen presence. Bisi stood, clutching the baby tightly against her. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to take a step toward the hallway. She reached for a small lantern on the table, her fingers shaking as she gripped it. The weak light barely pushed back the shadows. "Akin?" she called out, her voice quivering with desperation. The dragging sound stopped again. This time, it was followed by a low, guttural groan. It was coming from the back room. She hesitated. What if it was him? What if Akin was hurt and couldn't reach her? The thought pushed her forward. Step by step, she moved down the hallway, the lantern casting eerie, flickering shadows on the walls. When she reached the door to the back room, she stopped. It was slightly ajar. She pushed it open with her foot, the rusty hinges creaking loudly. The room was dark, except for the faint light from her lantern. In the center of the room lay Akin. His body was motionless, his face hidden in the shadows. "Akin!" she cried, rushing toward him. She dropped to her knees beside him, setting the lantern down. His skin was cold to the touch. Blood stained his shirt, seeping from a wound in his side. Bisi's chest tightened as tears streamed down her face. The impossible truth. Suddenly, Akin's hand shot up and grabbed her wrist. His eyes flew open, but they weren't his eyes. They glowed red, just like Esu's. Bisi screamed and stumbled backward, clutching the baby as Akin sat up. His movements were jerky, unnatural. "You chose," Akin said, his voice overlapping with another deeper, inhuman voice. "And now you face the cost." Bisi shook her head, backing away toward the door. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." Akin stood, his body twisting unnaturally as he stepped closer. His shadow stretched across the room, growing larger, almost swallowing the walls. "You wanted safety," he said, his voices blending. "But safety always comes at a price." A desperate escape. Bisi grabbed the lantern and threw it at him. The glass shattered and the flame flared up, but Akin, or whatever he had become, didn't flinch. With no time to think, she bolted out of the room, her baby wailing on her back. She ran down the hallway, her bare feet slamming against the cold floor. Behind her, she heard heavy, uneven footsteps. She reached the main room, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had sealed her inside. The footsteps grew louder. She turned and saw Akin emerging from the hallway, his face contorted into a horrific grin. "Bisi," he called, his voice mocking. "There's no way out." But Bisi's eyes darted to the window. Without hesitation, she grabbed a stool and smashed the glass. Sharp shards rained down, cutting her arms and legs as she climbed through. The cold night air hit her like a slap, and she stumbled onto the dirt outside. Behind her, the sounds of Akin, or the thing pretending to be him, echoed through the broken window. The Crossroads again. Bisi ran, her baby's cries mixing with her ragged breaths. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her back to the crossroads. The shadows and fire were gone, but Yesu was there, standing in the moonlight, waiting for her. "You brought this on yourself," he said, his tone almost amused. Bisi dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. What do you want from me? Isu tilted his head, his red eyes gleaming. I want nothing, Bisi. The question is, what do you want? Another choice, perhaps? Behind her, the sound of footsteps drew closer. Bisi turned and saw Akeen's twisted form stumbling toward her, the grin still plastered on his face. I'll do anything, she whispered. Just make it stop. Isu smiled. Anything? Be careful, Bisi. You've seen what your choices can do. She looked at her baby, her tears dripping onto his small face. She nodded. Anything. Isu extended his hand, and the air grew heavy. The crossroads seemed to pulse with energy as shadows began to swirl around them. Then make your final choice, he said, his voice echoing like thunder. The scene dissolved into darkness, leaving Bisi's scream lingering in the air.